This episode, I'm joined by Paul Bishop and Aaron French to discuss the overlap between the work of Friedrich Nietzsche and Rudolf Steiner, especially in relation to the spiritual and religious crisis of modernity. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast, gain access to some exclusive content, or just keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, welcome to both Paul Bishop and Aaron French to this episode on the work of Friedrich Nietzsche and Rudolf Steiner. But as we discussed, probably Goethe will definitely come in. So we have, Paul Bishop, Nietzsche scholar, and Aaron French, dare I say, a Rudolf Steiner scholar, if there can be such a thing, as we move from that sort of academic domain into the Akashic records. All of a sudden, the idea of scholarship becomes a bit murky. But we're going to be discussing their relationship because Steiner is one of the earlier people to write seriously on Nietzsche. He's also one of the last people to visit Nietzsche, and generally there is this sort of strange overlap between the two. So the dates we're sort of talking about, the overlap, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche is 1844 to 1900, and then Rudolf Steiner is 1861 to 1925. So these are the years that we're sort of overlapping and discussing here. And I think I'll begin with two questions, beginning with Paul and then moving through to Aaron sort of chronologically, which is, firstly, what is within Nietzsche's scholarship, is there much talk of, Steiner's Nietzsche? And then in Steiner scholarship for Aaron, what is the talk of this Nietzsche thing? So beginning with Paul, and then we can just open up the discussion.
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much. Very good question, James. I think the answer is going to be not a lot. And that Rudolf Steiner is someone who is, right or wrongly, and I think, and Aaron will bear me out on this, who is in academic studies perceived as marginal, and that carries on, I think, in the field of Nietzsche studies as well, even though, arguably, Nietzsche himself gets ever more pushed to the periphery, for one reason or another at the moment. And I think that's a shame, because what it does is to overlook the fact that Steiner did have an important role in getting Nietzsche out there in the early formative phase of Nietzsche reception. I think Steiner was an important figure. I think it's worthwhile saying as well that Steiner's writings on Nietzsche, or at least a couple of them, are very much the early rather than the later Steiner, so maybe have a different set of presuppositions that are there. But as I say, I think the answer is there's very little interest that's shown by the Nietzsche scholarly community on what Steiner, and indeed other people like Jung, make of Nietzsche. So there's a lot more work to be done in that area, one might say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Aaron, is this much the same with Steiner people?
Well, yeah, it's a bit different because, like, someone like Nietzsche, there was a tremendous amount of scholarship, I think, and now it's declining, where there was never really a tremendous amount of scholarship on Steiner. It's only now starting to be taken seriously, I guess, by some like historians and so forth, even though, of course, people in German wrote about him a lot. So there really isn't much on Steiner at all. And there are like books one could go to if they were working on a dissertation, but it's like, 10 to 20 books, in total or something. But so within that, there is relatively little work on his ideas about Nietzsche. Of course, because there's so many things he did and was interested in, and there's so many ways you could approach it that's not usually the one someone jumps to, although it's quite an interesting question. But what I was just mentioning before we started recording, I do know that there is one book. I mean, there's more in German, obviously, and there is one book that came out, which is basically considered to be like the biggest study on this. And the author's name is Marc. I'm blanking on his last name. He's now the current head of the Rudolf Steiner Archive in Dornach, and he did his habilitation on this on Rudolf Steiner's time when he worked at the Nietzsche Archive, and all of the debates that went on then, this kind of scandals. And it's quite a complicated story there about how Steiner was like supposed to get the job, but then didn't get it. And he felt that he'd been sort of betrayed, or there was like this is also a kind of debate of like, did Steiner turn it down, or did he get kind of pushed out in some underhanded way? And of course, there's a lot to that whole story. And I did not come at Steiner from the Nietzsche perspective either. So even I'm not fully up on what exactly is the relationship between Nietzsche and Steiner. I think there does need to be more work on that. But in this book, at least, maybe I can send it to you after in the German. If you can read German, you can get a good account of this period, because he went through all the letters and everything back and forth between the sister of Nietzsche, Steiner, and it was this other guy named Bernhard Suffen, I think was his name, and he was like the boss at the Goethe archive, but he also had some kind of connection to the Nietzsche archive at this time, and Nietzsche archive was just getting set up, so there was all kinds of strange goings on in this time, right when Steiner was there, actually, in Weimar.
Yeah, I guess I just sort of realized, I mean, we're dealing with the sort of hermetic example par excellence historically of what happens when two groups, the Nietzscheans, the academic scholarly Nietzscheans, and the Steinerians, and all this weird mixture of how far are we going to tread in one direction? Are we going to become scholarly with Steiner? Are we going to become Akashic recordy with Nietzsche? So there's this peculiar overlap of, and that thing that we can't really define of what is this line that we're talking about? Why are some people refusing to always tread? And, what is it they don't want to let in? But I guess one historical event to really pin down some sort of concreteness of what's going on here would be Steiner's somewhat infamous meeting with Nietzsche in his dying days. I'm not sure how far after the meeting it was when Nietzsche passed away, but at this point he was fairly gone, so to speak. But Aaron, you were telling me that there was some peculiarities around this meeting, and that actually this bedroom became somewhat of a Nietzschean shrine, or is this secret knowledge?
It was secret knowledge in the GDR time, but perhaps it's now it can be let out. Mm-hmm. I did just remember the name of the book. I'm sorry, I'll just say it. It's by David Marc Hoffmann, and it's called Das Basler Nietzsche-Archiv. I think that might not be the exact book. He's done several things on Nietzsche, but his name is David Marc Hoffmann. So he's the one who's dealt the most. He's the only one really who's dealt with Nietzsche and Steiner. And he's also works at the Goetheanum. So even there, he's a scholar for sure, but he's also sort of part of the scene there, But yeah, the Nietzsche, I think it's quite well known, Steiner's experience, and maybe to your audience or people listening, I think people sort of know this who are into Nietzsche, this thing Steiner says about seeing Nietzsche, because it's sort of fascinating. And so, yeah, but the thing about that was new to me when I visited the Nietzsche house, there's two Nietzsche houses. There's one in Naumburg, and then there's one in Weimar. The archive was originally in Naumburg, and this is where Steiner went and worked on the book, Fighter for Freedom, or Fighter Against His Time. Nietzsche, a Fighter for Freedom, or Fighter Against His Time. I can't remember the exact title, but it was interesting. When I went to Naumburg, they have now the house there, you can go visit it and so forth. And they have like a wall with all Nietzsche scholarship and books. So even like a little room where you can go sit in and read Nietzsche and so forth. And there actually were people in there, like students or something, doing Nietzsche. And there were all these books about Nietzsche that I guess were in a certain sense like the legacy of Nietzsche. And they had Steiner's book there. So it was interesting to me that it was represented there in this collection of stuff that had come out from Nietzsche. But it was this house where Steiner met Nietzsche. It was not the house in Weimar. Mm-hmm. So that's one little point of clarification, I think, from the last time I talked to you. So first, his sister had Nietzsche in this house where he was sick after he had his experience, with the horse and everything. And Steiner finally went there and met him and has this experience of seeing, just in a nutshell, like basically like Nietzsche's soul kind of hovering outside of his body, And Steiner says what he could see in this moment, this kind of visionary moment, is, and the body was like, you could see these pictures of Nietzsche toward the ends of his life, like this tortured body. But then, according to Steiner, this like the light of his spirit, his true spirit, uncorrupted maybe by this sick part behind him. he doesn't really go much into what that means necessarily. And this is just a thing in his autobiography that he mentions. I mean, Steiner's autobiography is quite interesting. He met all kinds of famous people, actually, from his life. And so this is his Nietzsche story. But the interesting thing about that is that I can add is that then Nietzsche was moved to Weimar, the Weimar house that Henry van de Velde built, this modernist architect's beautiful house, shrine to Nietzsche, has this N in a circle all over it, like a trademark. It looks like Superman, but with N, I don't know if this is deliberate. I don't think there was no Superman at the time, but for me, it looks like a superhero thing. But in this room, it was where Nietzsche died. He was kept up in the room there and was, very sick. And what was interesting for me is, of course, followers of Steiner read this account, and it's a very big deal that Steiner says this, but it turns out that this happened a lot, that a lot of people came pilgrimage to Nietzsche. And I don't have any exact examples, but they also had some kind of experiences seeing him in this state, and that his sister kind of kept him in there, and then would let certain people up and sort of open the door and let them go in and see the Nietzsche, there, and would have experiences of some kind. And then when he died, there was pilgrimages to this room. They called the death chamber, and they would hang things up almost like votive offerings or something. There's interesting pictures about this you can still see. And, this went on for a long time. And then the Nazis tried to build another temple next to the house, a sort of Nazi style temple to Nietzsche, which was never completed and is still there, just overgrown with weeds and so forth, next to the beautiful Art Nouveau house, which is still there. And now you can visit it. Mm-hmm. But in the GDR times, just to add this final part, they supposedly destroyed this room because this room had, sort of taken on some kind of spiritual, glow or essence or something special about this room. And so the Soviets thought that they wanted to get rid of this room. Apparently what you read when you go there is over fears that it would somehow reactivate this German nationalist spirit or something if they left this room around and people could go in there and so forth.
So Paul, I'm assuming Nietzsche scholars spend a lot of time sitting around discussing the detachment of Nietzsche's soul flowing above his head. Is that a common occurrence?
Yeah, I obviously didn't go to the right kind of conferences, do I? I mean, it's an interesting story, and says maybe more about Steiner than it does about Nietzsche. Perhaps another way to frame it is to think about. The entire problem that was there right from the word go in terms of Nietzsche reception, when you have the sister who's there pushing this line, inviting people round for dinner, and then Nietzsche's wheeled out, or the door is open, and people go in and look at him. This objectifying of him in that way. So I think that's one problem. Another problem is the whole tradition of that there is some sort of cachet around madness, the geistige Umnachtung, as it's politely called. So going into the dark spiritual night, you might say, the geistige Umnachtung, as a sort of going back to Hölderlin, the divine madness that's seen in some way. And I think that bedevils a lot of Nietzsche reception, or certainly did in the early years as well. And I don't know whether Steiner actually attempted to cure Nietzsche. And the reason why I say that is because there are accounts of dubious people like Julius Langbehn, who wrote the infamous Rembrandt-Aufsätze, Rembrandt as an educator, and a bit of a right-wing thinker. But Langbehn has this project to try and cure Nietzsche. And I think the same applies to Alfred Schuler, who was in the Cosmic Circle in Munich as well. So there's a lot of, how should we say, Nietzsche tourism going on, and even though that's not going to be the kind of thing that Nietzsche scholars are going to be talking about, it is one of the indications which makes it difficult to find that discursive space, I think, still today for Nietzsche in the academy, outside of the scholarly circles that are there. So it's okay for them, but it's how do we get Nietzsche more widely appreciated within the scholarly community? That's maybe not quite so easy today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we've dealt with the infamous history in a way, and I'm sure we'll draw more in. But I guess to throw in a big question of, just to draw in really the thought of both thinkers. Do either of you immediately comes to mind if I ask the question, if we were to say Steiner and Nietzsche, is there this common philosophical or theoretical thread which you go, that's where they're both drawing on? I mean, of course, the book Fighter for Freedom is freedom in that metaphysical, spiritual sense, both of them drawing from Kant and Goethe. Is freedom really what they're both, we could say, the kernel that they're both revolving around, where we can begin to draw them together as actual thinkers?
Who's going to go first?
Yeah, I would like to hear maybe what Paul would say about this, and I could go.
Then you can tell me where I'm wrong. I'd be grateful if you did. Well, I think again it's a super important question, because for me, in many ways, it highlights what seem to me the differences between Nietzsche and Steiner as far as that concept of freedom is concerned. You're absolutely right that they come out of this tradition, that both are thinking on, reacting to, engaging with what the thinkers that have come before them, like Goethe. I think we will have to say something about him, and Kant as well. But I would see them as then actually doing something really very, very different with them. As far as Nietzsche is concerned, he is going to be, well, he has an interesting view of Goethe, heavily reliant on him in certain respects, more critical in others, particularly when in Twilight of the Idols he says that Goethe didn't understand the Dionysian mysteries. So there's a limit on his appreciation of Goethe there. But certainly as far as Kant is concerned, because I think Nietzsche could accurately be described as resolutely anti-Kantian. He's got a campaign against Kant because he has continued in the modern world this bifurcation of the cosmos into phenomenon and noumenon, and he sees this as terribly, terribly dangerous. It's kind of another form of dualism, Platonic dualism, which goes on, and then brought into the sphere not just of metaphysics but of morals as well. And there, of course, Nietzsche's objection is very succinct. He thinks that as well as having the metaphysics of the hangman, he thinks that the Kantian morality is simply cruel. So we've got a campaign that's going on very much against Kant, I think probably against Hegel as well, and the freedom that Nietzsche's talking about. I think of this wonderful line that's there in the Three Metamorphoses section of Thus Spake Zarathustra, when he talks about, well, what's the function of the line in those three sequences of that sequence of three metamorphoses of the spirit. And the line, he says, is there because it's going to sich Freiheit schaffen, so to create this freedom for oneself. And it seems to be very important that freedom is not granted, it's going to have to be created, both in an existential as well as possibly as well in more collective senses. And that's why Nietzsche is attractive to early feminists and other political thinkers as well, not on the left and not just on the right. As I understand Steiner, and again, I'm willing to be corrected on this, and he would see himself much more aligned with Goethe and Kant. But then the question is, well, is Steiner's understanding of Goethe and Kant, how reasonable is that, or how defensible is that as a reading of them? And again, I'd be interested to explore how Steiner actually deals with figures like Kant, and therefore. For Steiner, that freedom is there and is available. You just have to hook into it into some way. It's like the Akashic Chronicle. You've got to find a means of accessing it in some way. So that freedom is there, that spiritual realm is there, and you've just got to access it. For Nietzsche, as I would see him, there isn't that spiritual realm, and what you're going to have to do is to fight to create freedom for yourself in the most profound existential sense at the moment. That's the way I'd see it stacking up at any rate.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And part of the reason why I wanted to hear what you thought about that is I know I did my dissertation on Steiner, but I know about his work on Nietzsche, but I don't know enough about Nietzsche. Of course, when I read Steiner, I had to read more Steiner, obviously, than Nietzsche and Goethe to do this work. But you can tell that Steiner, because he worked in the archives, both in the Goethe-Schiller archive, he also worked on Schopenhauer editions. Like, you can tell he really understands this stuff. And there's like a couple... Later in life, he has some things where I found in his lectures where he talks about being in the Nietzsche archive and finding, there's one funny story where he says he found that Nietzsche was responding to Eugen Dühring in terms of the eternal recurrence, and that he sort of says he thinks Nietzsche got it from trying to argue against him, something like this. So just that little detail makes me think Steiner knew what he was talking about. But there's a difficulty here, because this is something I also had to deal with, that there is, in a certain sense, two Steiners. There's like a pre-1900 Steiner and a post-1900 Steiner. Followers of Steiner, anthroposophists, as they're called, try to sort of show a continuity. Scholars such as Helmut Zander, for instance, is sort of the main European scholar who's worked on Steiner from a religious studies perspective, tries to show a kind of like a break here of some kind. And there's various ways you could interpret this breaking point of 1900. It's when Steiner joins the Theosophical Society. So and I'm not sure where I stand on this, but prior to 1900, it seems to me also, though, that Steiner seems to be more in line with agreeing with Nietzsche on this freedom thing, especially in terms of the need to create, maybe not so much values, but to create this freedom of thought out of yourself. And the reason why I think that he is a little bit more aligned in some ways, he's much more critical later, I think, and this is actually what I wanted to ask you about, because I don't know how much information there is about this. But so Steiner wrote his book, The Philosophy of Freedom, at this time when he was in Weimar and, thinking about Goethe, responding to the way they treated Goethe in the archive. He also didn't like their approach to Goethe. He said it was sort of like a museum of Goetheanism, He wanted these things to be alive somehow, to be doing something, these concepts. And the same thing about Nietzsche. He critiques Nietzsche's sister a lot later. At first, he says nice things about her, of course, when he's trying to get the job. But later, especially after she is publishing some of his work, he's very critical and says that she has no understanding of Nietzsche. And in his book, Fighter for Freedom, he talks about Max Stirner, this kind of more very strong sort of anarchistic impulse to freedom. I mean, Stirner's book was called Das Einzige in sein Eigentum. So it's like the property, ego is your own property. And even though Steiner, it is like, this is the debate, like the followers of Steiner would want to say all of these spiritual concepts were there with Steiner at this time, whereas a scholar has a more scholarly approach, or at least a more critical approach, to put it this way, say they were not really there. They came when he joined Theosophy to a larger extent. So this is why it's a bit of a difficult problem. But so he is thinking, at least to some extent, he is thinking about Kant. He is very critical of Kant. I mean, he read Kant from when he was younger, but in his first book that he wrote, he starts it off saying, we must end this Kantian dualism. Like, my whole life's mission is basically this. And he wants to get into this unknown realm of the noumenal. He doesn't want to just follow it out of duty. He says he wants to be able to perceive in there and think in there and to create in there. And I tried to argue that's what he's doing later in his life, that he's this is his mission and he's doing it. And then he has a bunch of followers with him on this, because then you're entering into sort of religion land or something. But the note, when he writes Philosophy of Freedom, he's thinking about Stirner, and Benjamin Tucker is another one. He's friends with these anarchist people and reading their writings, and he's thinking about Nietzsche in this way. He says in his book Fighter of Freedom that Stirner was the most free thinker before Nietzsche and did it better, basically. But Nietzsche is the same, but that what Nietzsche's Übermensch is this free person who has created their own freedom of their own ego, and their own way of thinking. But this Stirner, of course, was criticized at the time for this anarchism thing was a huge fear at the time. And I know you know about this too, because I was very grateful to your scholarship when I was doing my dissertation, because people like Klages and the Cosmic School and all of these people are not really written about much in English, so there was a whole, like Otto Gross is another one. There's a whole a scene about this anarchism thing. And Steiner was actually plugged into this, and people have criticized him of this. And now, he talks about philosophy of freedom, or you read about his ethical individualism, but he calls it himself in some of the early editions of Philosophy of Freedom, individualist anarchism is his project. So in that sense, I'm curious to maybe how you would respond, because I don't know Nietzsche well enough. Is individualist anarchism also a Nietzschean project, or is it not exactly the same thing?
Well, I think it was Karl Jaspers who said, for every statement you can find in Nietzsche, you can find a sort of equal and opposite opposing sort of statement. And I think anarchist individualism would certainly be one reading, and that you could find support in Nietzsche's texts for that, for a whole variety of positions. And of course, and that's one of the reasons why he has been such a seminal thinker, is because he was able to fire people who were interested in individual reform, collective reform on the right, on the left. This is the extraordinary potency of Nietzsche's thought. Someone who writes about the death of God and who yet is very, very actively received in theological circles as well, and continuing to this day. So that I think makes that's Nietzsche's speciality, as it were, is being able to fire people to inspire them in all directions. Go back to the question of Steiner's reception of Kant. Yeah, you're quite right that he says we've got to overcome this dualism. But I think that Steiner would be wanting to overcome that dualism in a way which is, and I think again you're right, reflects his engagement with Madame Blavatsky rather than with German idealism. Because as I would see Nietzsche is wanting to get rid of that dualism because he just doesn't believe in this dualistic approach. He thinks, no, we've lyingly added, he says, this noumenal realm. Where the backwoodsmen have invented this fantasy, which has come out of Judeo-Christianity, and it's a profound mistake, and it's invidious, and it's dangerous for life. It stops us living properly, and we've got to get rid of it. And so that's his project. It seems that Steiner is anti-Kantian in a completely different way, because he accepts the difference between the phenomenal and the noumenal, but then goes on to say, well, I can tell you something about this noumenal realm, and we get in there, which is the one thing, according to Kant, you can't do. That's what makes it noumenal, is that you're not going to be able to get in there. It's not a philosophical question then. It may be a religious one, or even then, if one looks at Kant's ideas of religion within the bounds of pure reason, is a very curious kind of religion. It's certainly not a religion as it's traditionally been conceived of. So it seems to me that there is something profoundly, I hesitate to say the word wrong, but I find it hard to follow Steiner when he sets about his reading of Kant and then proceeds to say, well, in fact, we can know something about this noumenal realm. Isn't that just a misreading of what Kant and the critical philosophy is trying to do?
Yeah, it's a big question that I cannot do justice to, I don't think. One thing I could say about it, though, is this is also the difficulty, is that he's not really talking about anything but from Blavatsky till after 1900, So in this period where he says this stuff about Nietzsche, he's of course worked with Schopenhauer, and he's produced a sort of edited volume, like an edited volume of this. But he's mostly arguing against both Kant, against this Kantian not being able to know the thing in itself through using Goethe. And I think that this is actually even more I don't know if mysterious is the word, but more difficult, because it's his own understanding of Goethe. As it's his own understanding of Nietzsche, to some extent, it's his own interpretation of Goethe. It was not the interpretation of Goethe that he found when he went to the Goethe-Schiller archives, because they had the idea that Goethe was a great literary figure, and he had this natural science thing, which was poetic, artistic, not really science. Therefore, it's sort of an oddity. And we're going to focus on the literary stuff. And Steiner's idea was almost the opposite. Of course, he appreciated the literary stuff, but he wanted to see these scientific concepts, that Goethe developed as Goethean science, put into practice. He thought that somehow this is the way around Kant. And again, I don't know it. I haven't read his early writings well enough to know exactly how he argues for that. I mean, part of what he tries to say is things like these sort of archetypal forms that Goethe comes up with, that Goethe says, if you study nature in this sort of you bring yourself into nature and you study the plant. You meditate on the plant, that you can come to a sort of relationship with the plant it's basically like a proto-phenomenological kind of approach to science in a certain sense. And through this process, Goethe developed his theory of forms and morphology and so forth. And again, I don't know exactly how he argues it. And I don't think he necessarily argued it in a way that convinced everyone, because it's partly why he's still sort of a minor figure in some ways in these fields. But he tried to use these ideas of Goethe to argue against Kant at first. He then comes to theosophy and then goes much more in a direction where he's now fleshing out this realm, whatever it is out there. But in this time around Nietzsche, he's still sort of using Goethe. He's using this anarchism thing, and in his philosophy of freedom, he goes a lot into this whole notion about thinking, that somehow the thinking of the percept and the concept, that this bridge, maybe you read some of this, that the bridge between these two, what do we call them? Things, I guess, the percept of the concept and the concept, that form the bridge of the formation of the concept when one thinks it. The activity in between the two is the important point, and it's this sort of middle zone where, for him at least, it's you're sort of able to sort of pop out of what he calls sensible thinking. He somehow thinks you can get to a sort of sense-free thinking at this phase, mostly, and this sense-free thinking is then overcoming. Then you can know things of the noumenal realm rather than what he says. His interpretation of Kant is, Kant says you can never know, just do it because you're told to from laws or something. He says we don't have laws. We can actually somehow think in this world and perceive in it. But of course, so that, maybe I'll stop there. But that's a little bit of background of where he was trying to approach it, at least in this early phase.
So, I agree with you that I suppose I'd say the early work of Steiner is in some respects is going to be where one would have the greatest opportunities for scholarly discussion, because he's doing editorial work on Goethe's scientific writings. I think you're absolutely right that he's part of a rediscovery or a renewed appreciation of that aspect of Goethe's work, which has tended to be neglected. Of course, it's given then rise in its turn to the idea of Goethean Science and people like Henry Bortoft, so that there's a body of work that's come out of that. And I appreciated well that Steiner is an important part of this critique of the way that Goethe is presented in bourgeois academic circles, which are also very slowly and subtly, but in fact killing him. I mean, I think killing the interest in Goethe, and that's one of the things which I think is most memorably expressed by that episode in Hermann Hesse's Damien, when he goes to the house of the Germanistic professor, and he sees this Goethe model on the bust on the mantelpiece, and he gets very, very worked up indeed. It's Steppenwolf, actually. It's not Damien. It's in the Steppenwolf that he has this moment where he's absolutely infuriated by it, because it's this bourgeois appropriation, this taming, this making safe of a figure who is going to be, for the Steppenwolf, so much more existentially important, and it's going to be Goethe and Mozart laughing and this rediscovery of what it means to be alive, and that's not there in the bourgeois little statue of Goethe, which is on the professor's mantelpiece. So I think he's got an important role there as well. But it looks as if we're saying that it's when he then becomes interested in theosophy and then starts to rework it in terms of anthroposophy. I wonder, would it be fair to say that he then himself takes a more instrumental view of figures like Goethe and Kant and Nietzsche, which was where we started, and what he's doing with them is maybe very interesting and valuable if one commits to Steiner's outlook. But he is actually he's appropriating them, misappropriating them, if one was going to be critical, for his own argumentational ends. Would that be fair?
Yeah, and of course that's certainly the perspective of Goethe scholars. So you won't find, even though Steiner did all of this work at the beginning here, when Goethe's idea of science was first starting to maybe be taken in some kind of way seriously, he was there suggesting this and, pushing for it. And you can see his little, when he was editing through Goethe's scientific writings, there are notes in there in the archive from Steiner that he wrote. It's quite interesting to look at it. But if you read like books nowadays that are trying to take Goethean science seriously, they will have a footnote to Steiner about Steiner usually, and it'll be something like this, that he sort of presents an overly mystical kind of interpretation of Goethe that even Goethe didn't really, this wasn't even really what he thought was, and I think that that's true, actually. I mean, I do agree with that. For me, it's not a reason to discount it, but I understand why it is. What I tried to argue in my dissertation to maybe just have a different perspective on this whole thing, and that's why I compared him to Max Weber, because they were both around the same time, to sort of look at what did Steiner say he was doing and think he was doing, let alone maybe how he acted and how his followers perceived him and acted. I think he thought he was doing this creation of a sort of new Weltanschauung out of himself for the future, for this is just sort of revitalization of all elements of culture from this bottom position, which I think he agreed with about Nietzsche, that we had arrived at this sort of poverty of all knowledge or something, or poverty of science and so forth. That out of that, an entirely new Weltanschauung, an entirely new set of values, an entirely new set of practices and cultural norms. All of this had to be not done by following the laws of the church or something else, but had to be produced out of oneself. So I think he thinks he's doing that to some extent. That's my sort of reading of it. And why I thought that could be valuable to think about is because I compared him with Weber, who said the same thing, but never then did anything different. He kind of stopped with saying, and this is actually Steiner's critique of Nietzsche, stopped with saying, we're at the end here. We've reached the abyss. Nihilism is the next step. See ya. And so it's in that silence that Steiner says, oh no, here's what we do. We look into the Akashic record, we meditate, we do alchemy, schooling, we do alchemy. He suddenly shows all of these things that he says are the way forward. Doesn't mean they're right, I tried to argue, but I think he thinks he's doing what is needed in the next step, following in this kind of same tradition and agreeing in that sense that we've sort of reached the end of philosophy in a certain sense, something like that, the end of intellectual development, or however we want to think about it in the sort of Nietzschean terms.
Well, I think it's certainly true that one can look at a thinker and say, well, one needs to be differentiated, and one can say, well, this is where he's correct in his understanding, or there's evidence to support this understanding. It's a reasonable understanding. There are other areas where it doesn't work quite so well, to put it mildly. And I think that's one of the problems, that the Academy has not been sufficiently differentiated in its approach to Steiner. It's always very quick to point out that he gets this wrong, he does that, making accusations about aspects of theories relating to race, anti-Semitism, and so on. And that as a result, one's lost the sense of why Steiner was so important at the time, partly in getting discussion about these figures out there. I mean, I think anybody must be hugely impressed by the immense lecturing activity that Steiner does, and all over the show. I mean, there's a sort of perpetual roadshow as he goes around, and not just to bourgeois audiences, but also to working class audiences as well. And this seemed to me quite remarkable, that you can have that you can create a genuinely popular intellectual culture where people come out of the factories or up out of the mines, and instead of wanting to go down to the pub, they say, no, let's go and listen to Rudolf Steiner talking about Kant this evening. That is really quite remarkable in terms of the ability of him to have impact, as I suppose they would say in academic circles today, for him to have this outreach to popular audiences of that kind. And of course, he recycles a lot of material. Why not? Who doesn't? That seems fair enough. The point is that he does have those audiences that that are there. And again, it's a bit like, in that respect, it's a bit like Ludwig Klager's, that these people are operating outside of the academic framework, and perhaps that's something that the academics will never forgive them for, is for trying to kind of circumvent the lecture hall in which is controlled by the institution. At the same time, I suppose one of the difficulties that I would say as someone who is, interested in Steiner, open-minded, and wanting to learn more about it and so on, is that the Steiner community itself is maybe not, how should we say, as keen on public engagement as one would want it to have to be in terms of going out and explaining and being open for friendly criticism of what Steiner is doing. Do you think that there's is that a fair criticism to make of the way that Steinerians or anthroposophists have dealt with the work of their master?
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's also part of the reason I went into academia to try to study it, because I wanted to do something different about it and to try to get a different approach, different perspective. So Steiner says that, there's one example. Steiner says this, but also, I'm just realizing we're maybe getting away from Nietzsche. So here's it's not about Nietzsche, this example, but this is my last, it relates to at least Steiner's reception. He said he himself was doing a new form of science. This is another thing all these people are on about. Perhaps Nietzsche too, if I'm right, but maybe you could correct me on that. But how can one develop a new form of science? Weber and these other neo-Kantians also were trying to do this thing. Steiner was also doing it. For him, in his little world, Steiner says he did do it. Here it is. It's this anthroposophy thing. It's real science. And then, of course, all of his followers take it up and they say, okay, yes, it's science. But of course, to scientists, it's pseudoscience. So you then sort of end up in this debate between, well, what is science, and the sort of authorized science and pseudoscience, arguing, especially here in Europe with the homeopathy and so forth. So I think there are sort of entrenched roads here from this whole thing. So for me, this wasn't really important. So I don't care whether it's a science or not. I mean, I'm at the point now, we're in the post-truth world. Do I believe in that there is a science come down from God that no. So it doesn't matter to me whether it's a science or not. What was more interesting to me was the experience, what he did, why, sort of learning about the history a little bit more. So I tried to think about him more in the terms of in my dissertation, I wrote about him as a sort of visionary mystic, a visionary, storyteller, myth teller, something like that. Of course, that's not what he necessarily said about himself. There's some phrases where he says, I'm not teaching people, I'm just telling you my experience, But I think, to go back to the final point on that, I think that is definitely part of the problem. The problem is from two sides. It's not from one side, and it's this one side wanting to insist maybe to take this seriously as a science, and another side, maybe the academic side, saying, well, this is a pseudoscience. You expect me to sort of believe that we can, how am I going to even prove these sorts of statements? What kind of activity is this even? This is just silly to even go to be doing this. So the whole thing just sort of gets thrown out, or something like that.
I think that's very common, that there needs to be a rapprochement from both sides on that. But I wonder if there's been something of a missed opportunity to precisely around something. And I want to say something about Nietzsche too, but also about Goethe. The critique that Goethe makes of intellectual developments in his day, and one could see Goethe as being very far-sighted in seeing the way that things are going to go. I think that same far-sightedness applies to Nietzsche as well. Perhaps that's what sends him mad in the end. It is conceived that there are certain tendencies in the way that science is being practiced in his day. But what Goethe does is to say, what I want, he picks up on he has this thought where he talks about Heinrold's and anthropology as describing his own Goethe's thought as being ein gegenständliches Denken, an objective thought. So objective in the sense of it's related to an object. It's not objektives, it's gegenständlich. In other words, it's to do with objects, it's to do with things. It's to do with the physical world. And that therefore part of the experience is it's both contemplative, meditative, but it's also hands-on. It's engagement with the world. It's appreciation of that material aspect. And maybe nowadays with, the idea of virtual reality becoming more and more powerful. Maybe that this really is an idea that's come. But to me, then Steiner doesn't take that approach. Instead, he wants to say, well, it's objective in the sense of, well, it's my objectivity. It's my truth, I suppose, Steiner would say. But that seems to me as a problem, or at least as a problem, in as much as I wonder how far it's accurately reflecting what's really important about Goethe. And one of the things that seemingly, therefore, is such a shame is that we've got Steiner here popularizing Goethe and popularizing Goethean science in the way that Goethe himself proposes it. But maybe what is so important there, this gegenständliches Denken, this objective thought, this insistence on the materiality and the way that we are shaped by our own materiality as well, that point's gone missing because we disappear off to the spirit realm all too quickly, and that creates a problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in his writings, he does try to follow this line, at least rhetorically. I mean, he says himself that with Goethe, to stay with Goethe, to stay with the materiality. He never says to leave the materiality. In fact, he says quite clearly, the material world is the spiritual world turned inside out. Therefore, you must stay with the material world. You can't leave the material world. And why is he saying that? I imagine the way you just described is probably something that he's at least thinking about or has come up with, So he says this is what he says. But of course, putting something like that into practice, and then especially, as this thing develops through the First World War he lived through, at least, I mean, things get quite messy all over the place. And so whether or not that kind of approach remains throughout, I'm not really sure. But at least in the beginning, in these early years, that seems to be what he's trying to go with. Something about the material world is actually the way to sort of get into the spiritual, this sort of Geist, and this is where like a more phenomenological idea. I guess to bring it back to Nietzsche, what you were saying earlier then is so. One ways we can think they're different, and I think this is true, that in Steiner's idea, he's disagreeing with Kant on this noumenal realm thing, that we can access this world, we can form, the way he puts it, new organs of perception, which are thinking, Gedanken, organs of thinking, and then we can, have some kind of intuition in this other world. But for Nietzsche, if I'm understanding right, in his mind, the whole notion of this noumenal world is there is no noumenal world, but the whole notion of the noumenal world is a fraud. And so, what then is this where we come to this sort of nihilism thing? Because it's a fraud, what then is there?
It's one of the things that can lead to nihilism. I think that Nietzsche would say is that the dualistic belief is itself already nihilistic, because in it devalues the material world against the supposed other spiritual realm. So I think that one of the forms that nihilism that Nietzsche would identify would precisely be in his understanding of Judeo-Christianity as really as a kind of acceptable form of nihilism, and a nihilism that's become institutionalized and dangerous to life. It ruins lives, and it takes away from life its materialistic, vitalistic qualities as well, because everything is going to be subordinated to this other realm, which, on Nietzsche's account, isn't there. That's one form of nihilism. Another form of nihilism then comes in saying, well, we're going to devalue the material world as well, or we're going to simply negate what is around us. We're going to devalue the values. That's the nihilistic bit, rather than creating the new values, which is so much harder. That's what we need the freedom for. Going back to the three metamorphoses, that's what we need to have the line for, is to create the space for freedom, to create the space for the freedom for the creation of values. But he says that's not enough. after our camel has become a lion, the lion has created this space, this freedom, then we need to have this creation of values. That's why the third emblem of the child is introduced, because it's through this play, this creativity, this not a discovery of values, but it's going to be a creation of them. Again, that seems to be a difference between the way that Steiner thinks about things, the way that Nietzsche thinks about things. Nietzsche's going to say these new values are going to have to be created and only out of ourselves, and maybe only out of the self, which is what the Übermensch is, this whatever that looks like. And of course, in Twilight of the Idols, it looks as if one of the models for the Übermensch is in fact going to be Goethe, interestingly enough. And this vitalistic concept that he has of presenting Goethe as he puts it, the antipodes, the very opposite of Kant. Whereas with Steiner, as I understand Steiner, then because there is that spiritual realm there, and because there are the Akasha Chronicles, and because there is this access to the noumenal realm, therefore that seems to be profoundly un-Nietzschean.
I want to ask actually what James also a comment on some. What do you think about this?
The main thing I was thinking is it's peculiar in a way that you have these two paths which in a way stay parallel for some time. So, Steiner at 14 years of age is hiding a copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason behind his coursework. I mean, that's absolutely precocious. Nietzsche at a young age is, as I remember, if I'm remembering rightly, keeps his feet in freezing cold water at night so he can stay up late, likely to read Critique of Pure Reason at that point in his life. So, but for both of these thinkers, there is this understanding that Kant is of seminal importance. But it seems obviously at one point Nietzsche is, to do with a complete denial, but oddly from a Schopenhauerian position. So he's moving from Schopenhauer's, he calls Schopenhauer the master because he at least accepted. I guess the difference there would be Schopenhauer just said there may be this thing called the noumenal, but we can never have access to it. So there you go, deal with that and go be miserable or whatever. It's all to do with the will. But Nietzsche is then just denying it. Steiner, on the other hand, I think at 24, he completes Kant's, the system of German idealism, which is, I'm now 28. It's a bit upsetting that at 24 he completed it, but there you go. But it seems that oddly that they are still on the same path with respect to what Nietzsche would consider the death of God, right? So there has been something that has happened which has made it possible to actually even be having these discussions all together. So they're in agreement that something has died which allows a common objective values to promulgate throughout society, and they're both dealing with it their own way. But Nietzsche seems to be dealing with it in an entropic sense of, let's just take it right down to the bottom and then see what happens. Whereas Steiner's like, okay, we've still got the divine, but we can't have the old Judeo-Christian or traditional divine, so let's just explode it into this Akashic insane thing. So it's peculiar that there's clearly a reason that they both can be in dialogue despite this difference, but it's almost like they're dealing with the same question, but both going at it at different extremes, but ending up, this is the question I want to ask is, they still have this teleology of freedom, but they still seem to end up in this same place of overcoming, individual overcoming, despite the fact that Nietzsche's denying the noumenal and Steiner is converting it into this. I don't even want to go there because it's it's all over the place, right? Steiner's notion of the divine is peculiar.
Yeah, and maybe if I could just add one thing. Thank you for your thoughts on that, helping me also move a little bit forward and how I'm thinking about this. What he says then, it is a religious thing. Like in one sense, we can say one person is more religious at some than the other in some. When I tried to do Weber and Steiner, there was some similarities in this too, that they both seem to be thinking similar things, having the same questions, coming to similar conclusions, but like very different lives, very different presentations, and so forth. So religion might be one way we could think about it, because of course what Steiner says then when he arrives, let's say at the same place as Nietzsche, he then says we need occultism, and this happens after his encounter with theosophy. But I think it's important to remember how radical theosophy was, at this time. I mean, this was a religion, or this was a movement that claimed to be able to harmonize religion and science, and this was the whole problem, that they were all dealing with. So we could say that perhaps he over enthusiastically embraced this. This project of, it wasn't just the theosophist, Crowley, all the occultists at this time claimed something to be able to harmonize this religion and science problem, somehow bring these two things together. And of course, this is the problem they all seem to be driving themselves crazy about, especially in Europe at this time. So this is something like a religion. Like, is he saying we're replacing, anthroposophy? But he also just calls it occultism. He says like pure occultism. He tries to talk about it, which is, what is occultism? It's just like, blend, what you said, blend of Eastern and Christianity and meditation and psychic stuff, blending this stuff all together. And he says that this, like some kind of true expression of this, which he also claims is to be scientific, this is like the road forward out of the mess, at least for him. And maybe I can just say one more thing before we turn it over to Paul, because just to stick with what Steiner says about this whole thing, according to him at least, this Superman, why he agrees with Nietzsche up to a point, that this sort of Superman concept, Übermensch, is like the road forward in some way. But he then says that for Nietzsche, he was sort of trapped. I brought some quotes. I'm not going to read them all, but I gathered a few quotes to try to make sense of this myself. And in many of them, he says something like, yes, this Übermensch is the road forward. But Nietzsche is stuck in his intellectual, sort of climate, and can't, and so he just produces a sort of abstract, this is Steiner speaking, I have the quote here, a sort of abstract, vague, idea about this Übermensch. He sees it, he lives it within himself and experiences it, but he gives the concept, but he doesn't, but that's it. He doesn't give the sort of like, I don't know if the methods and the practices is the right word, but something like that. Like, he doesn't give the next scene in the novel. And so, at least in Steiner's own, argument, his own rhetoric, this is what he's claiming to do. And I think he would also say he's creating it, out of himself. But then as soon as you link it to this theosophy stuff, it is true when you say something like the Akashic record, you're then attempting also to link it to some kind of universal truth, right? So it's quite a contradictory, kind of problematic tension trying to entertain that position,
Well, that's a lot of points there to pick up on. Just to take three of them, maybe. I'm glad you used the word occultism first, rather than Lee, but now it's been used to like a red rag to a bull. I'm not going to let it entirely lie, but I mean, you're absolutely right. This is the great age of occultism, spiritualism. There are people like Carl Duprel. James, did you have someone on talking about Carl? You did have someone.
Yeah. We republished his first volume.
There we go. That's right. And you've got him then saying, well, Kant would have been Kant is a spiritualist, and so on. So we've got all that going on. I think I'm also right in saying that Nietzsche on one occasion attended a séance as well. So goodness knows what he made of that. So there certainly is that aspect of putting it back in its historical context. And I think one of the things that I appreciate most about your work, Aaron, is that you do look at it in its intellectual historical context. And I think that is really important, and one of the ways that one's going to get something valuable out of Steiner if one does that. At the same time, though, I keep on thinking, since we've talked about occultism and spiritualism and sort of inner truths and my truth and so on, of that great passage in from the same essay that I was talking about, where Heidegger talks about the objectivity, the Gegenständliches Denken. I think there's a great passage where Goethe says this. He says, I must admit that I've been long suspicious of the great and important sounding task, know thyself. Okay, so there we are, the Delphagorical. Goethe says, this has always seemed to me a deception practiced by a secret order of priests who wish to confuse humanity with impossible demands, to divert attention from activity in the outer world to some false inner speculation. And that what seems to me, I think that's what he'd want. That's what Goethe would say to Steiner as well, is to say, look, this activity in the outer world, okay, you're building a Goetheanum, burns down, you build another one, you've got houses, you've got, your banks and all that, but that's still not quite as gegenständlich, as objective as Goethe would like it to be, because of this false inner speculation. I mean, that's really uncompromising, it seems to me, on Goethe's part. That's the bit where he sounds to me most like Nietzsche, or as a forerunner of Nietzsche. And then just to pick up this point, I wanted to say as well that we've got this very peculiar thing with Nietzsche, that on the one hand, there he is, radically anti-Newmanist, radically anti-Kantian, and so on, and yet not devoid of his own mystical moments himself. But thinking, for example, of the way that he describes in Ecce Homo the composition of Zarathustra, that great passage where he says, does anybody have any concept of what inspiration's like? Well, I'm going to tell you. And then follows this extraordinary description of what looks very much like, what sounds very much like a mystical experience that he talks about. So Nietzsche is not a kind of a limited materialist. I think if he's a materialist, then one could say he's a vitalist materialist as well. And that opens up this opportunity for an experiential dimension, which is absolutely central to what he's saying in Ecce Homo about Zarathustra. I mean, that's his version of saying it's my truth. He's saying, thus speaks Zarathustra is my truth. This is how it came to me. So it's a peculiar kind of aspect of Nietzsche that, and maybe what also then makes him congenial to people on the theological side, that there is just that little bit of room left open for a mystical understanding of what he's saying as well. That said, I'd want to put some kind of limitations on it, and I get worried when I read Steiner on Nietzsche, and he talks about, I've got it here, the German edition. He talks about Nietzsche beginning with Geist anschauen in a mythical form, spiritual anschauen in a mythical form. Okay, right? He goes on, Apollo and Dionysus were Geistgestalten, spiritual forms which he experienced. And then he goes on, and I'm not so certain about that. I'm not so certain that when Nietzsche talks about Apollo and Dionysus in The Birth of Tragedy, which is the key work for him, setting up his system, his coming to terms with Schopenhauer, and so on, he says, well, I'm going to use Apollo and Dionysus, and you can describe them as Gottheit, and you can describe them as gods, but I'm going to describe them as Triebe, as drives, as formal drive. This is where he's very, very close to Schiller. So under the idea of a formal drive and a material drive and a ludic drive, a synthesis which comes out between the two of those drives. And it seems to me that idea of Apollo and Dionysus are drives, and an occultistic reading, a spiritual reading, a numinal reading, a Geistanschauung reading, seems to me to be a little bit of a distortion of what makes that text so important and significant for us even today.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, I think this is actually related to sort of one of the questions we talked about too, about like, how does Steiner read Nietzsche's work? How does Steiner see his work in relation to Nietzsche's work? And I had several passages that I picked out here, which you just touched on a little bit. I think why he's saying that. I don't know if I would read them all, but just for an example, he gives, this is in his Riddles of Philosophy book. He talks about how, and this seemed to me is also like, Steiner is appropriating all these things for sure. Like he's making Goethe be like him, what he's doing. I think this is also true. I think he's also doing this with Nietzsche in a certain sense. Is he doing this for validation? Is he doing it just because he likes these guys so much? I don't know. Maybe some of both or something. But for in Nietzsche's case, what he says in relation to the quote you just said there, he says that Nietzsche had to live out and experience the ideas and concepts of his time in an intensely personal and subjective way. So in this quote here, he goes on to say things that this is the Steiner reading of this, that these concepts were forced on him by Wagner, he felt, later in life. And then he had to free himself from these sort of mythological ideas. But he says that maybe I'll just read just a little bit of this so he can do a better job than I can do explaining it. He says, Nietzsche is confronted with the world conceptions of the second half of the 19th century, and it becomes his destiny to experience personally all the delight, but also all the sorrows that this world conception can cause if they affect the human soul, not only theoretically, but with his entire individuality at stake. Nietzsche's philosophical life developed in such a way that the representative world conceptions of modern times would completely take hold of him, forcing him to work himself through his own solutions in the most personal experiences of life. Others think philosophy. Nietzsche had to live philosophy. For this reason, Nietzsche becomes more and more a poet as he presents his picture of world and life. It is also for this reason that a reader who cannot agree with Nietzsche's presentation insofar as his philosophy is concerned can still admire it because of its political power, end quote there. So 2 points about that. There are other passages where he talks about this, 2 things. That there's one where he says that Nietzsche is not fully in his body. This is, we're now getting into the occultism stuff a little bit. We can't avoid it and actually talk about this. So Nietzsche never fully incarnated, sort of hovers outside of his body, can't get into his body. This is one thing he says about Nietzsche in several places. The other thing is that he, in a certain sense, he seems to be saying something like he embodied the zeitgeist of the second half of the 19th century, and meaning that he wasn't just thinking these philosophical concepts, but he had to experience them, like see them, basically, in a certain sense. I think is maybe the passage you were pointing out there, that even with these mythological sort of archetypes, that he had some kind of, it's like mystical again sounding, some kind of like experience of these things, with living them personally in his life. So there's these two, I don't know what we would say, attributes, qualities of Nietzsche. That's his own reading of it. But of course, you're not going to find anybody else saying that about Nietzsche. So what is this? You can almost say this is like a psychological, spiritual kind of interpretation, his own, of Nietzsche. And there's sort of more in that direction. He goes on later after this, the whole theosophy, taking in theosophy, this is where he's talking this way much more. And I don't know what you make of that, but I think that is what you were picking up on. He expands on this even more when he's saying, like, what does this mean that he's seeing these sort of mythos, these mythological forms? And the final point is, I describe Steiner basically the way that Steiner just described Nietzsche. So it's interesting that, what is going on here? I mean, that's kind of the way that, like, I do think in some ways Steiner thought he was doing that. And it's a bit blurry now to really make sense of it for a variety of reasons, because of his followers, because of how big the movement got, because of the translation and editing issues, which have been a whole mess, because he just, he gave lectures all over the place and they were taken in shorthand by a stenographer. And apparently they can no longer read some of this because they've forgotten how. During World War II, many things were purged and altered to make him seem more Aryan and so on. So that could also probably be why the whole thing is a bit difficult to penetrate, what exactly he was all about and why things seem so contradictory. But for me, that's kind of the way what he said about Nietzsche is what I'm thinking about Steiner, that he's sort of embodying in this visionary, poetic way. I think he thinks he's doing that. And I don't know if he would agree with Nietzsche if he's coming to some kind of poetic creation of values, but Steiner definitely thinks that's what he's doing with his anthroposophy, and says this all the time, that, the new man or the new thinker, philosopher is an artist in poetry. And so therefore it's like an artistic thinking, something like that. And he claims that this is what, he claims this for Nietzsche and for Goethe. This is also convenient.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with you that one could describe Steiner as a kind of seismograph of the time, and in fact, that's what I would see as being one of the reasons why, whatever academia thinks, that Rudolf Steiner is an important figure, because he does reflect on, throw light on issues at his time, and perhaps also on our own time as a result. So I'm entirely open to that. And I think that, for example, the attention that Steiner pays to not so much Christianity, but the pagan mysteries is very revealing for the way that Nietzsche writes about the pagan mysteries as well. Again, strange to think of Nietzsche, the great atheist, actually being very interested in pagan religion, or at any rate using it as an argumentational motif in the Antichrist. and equally the subjective nature of interpretation. Well, I think you're right. Every interpretation is going to have a degree of subjectivity about it. And if we have Derrida's version of Nietzsche, and if we have Foucault's version of Nietzsche, and Baudrillard's, and the whole post-structuralist views of Nietzsche, well, which are themselves highly subjective, and indeed would in some cases revel in their subjectivity, and this playful interpretation, and the semiotics spreads across the room as you do your interpretation. So again, it's all right for them, maybe because they're French, but not for Steiner, and that seems a little unfair. And I think that's really what Gottfried Benn was trying to articulate in a way about the significance of Nietzsche. There's this great passage where Gottfried Benn says Nietzsche, is the most important thinker of our time because he experienced all of these issues and confrontations. And I think I think I'd take Gottfried Benn's word for it there. At the same time, I'm a little chary about the sort of Nietzsche as lone hero, because that seems to be a different kind of subjectivity. There seems to be the danger is that Nietzsche then becomes a kind of a screen onto which one's own preoccupations can become projected. And that's legitimate up to the point where one says, no, that is actually what Nietzsche is doing. And there you'd want to say, well, no, it isn't. That's what people are projecting onto Nietzsche. And I suppose it's really just a simple point about, intellectual honesty in saying, well, is that really Nietzsche, or is that Steiner's appropriation of him?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this brings us to a crucial point. And part of this, to be fair, could be obscured because of the history that I just mentioned about his work. But this is something that doesn't happen with Steiner. He then is not, and he tries to get a job in Jena after he finishes his dissertation and so forth in the philosophy department, and it doesn't work out. And this is when the occultism really kicks in, after he has a kind of moment of darkness. And then he's outside of the academy, So I think this is one of the issues here, that if one in the academy has a bit more, perhaps transparency, or at least does it in a different way that's more congenial with colleagues. And this is the method, this is the training. We do it this way, even if we're doing it like the French and, being very subjective. Whereas here's a person who leaves the academy, is doing all this in the public realm, and has lots of followers, and basically is just making claims. And again, this is a bit hard to know in any real concrete way because of, as I mentioned, and of course you can find, what's the fun thing about trying to even study Steiner is you can find endless contradictions. Him saying one thing and saying the opposite. Some of that's him. Some of that is half the things we have are notes, from people in lectures. So some of that is just, error, but some of it maybe, he's making these contradictory statements based on maybe his audience or based on whatever. But it doesn't ever really, I think this is also part of why, especially academics have a problem with this. It doesn't reach that level of maybe transparency or sort of acknowledging my reading, on it. At the same time, it's interesting, like coming from, I went to the University in California, like because of this sort of relativism and postmodernism, deep history, and some people are like don't want people to do that, and like are looking for some kind of truth again. But of course, this is then we get into the whole danger about authoritarianism and blah blah blah. But it is interesting that this tension, I guess, is all I'm bringing out here. Maybe we can see this tension in Steiner a little bit as well. I mean, what did people want? They wanted answers, and he did have answers of a kind about certain things. I mean, people would come to him. This is how a lot of this got started, is people would say, come show us how to do a new liturgy. We're a bunch of theologians. And so he just makes something, he doesn't make it up. He does something and then gives it to him. That people come and say, we want new forms of agriculture because of these horrible conditions and what's going on in the East in Poland and so forth. He goes to Poland and he gives a whole lecture about this occult agriculture. He does the same thing with the school in Stuttgart and this cigarette factory, and the factory workers can't want a different kind of education for their kids. So it's a tension here, I think, about it. It also brings in the idea of academia. Is it, is the point to just sort of go find these practical things? Or should we, is it to step back and to acknowledge? I don't know. You know what I mean? I don't have the answer. This is what I basically have to, the position I have to take as a scholar. I don't have the answer. Don't look to me for any answers. Maybe it's being extreme, but just to make my point there,
Well, no, I think that's a very fair point, and if I may say so, a very Nietzschean one in many ways, because it seems to me that that's what Nietzsche feels as someone who goes, is absolutely going the academic route and absolutely going the early tenure route and so on, and he's doing it all. He's doing the publications. He's editing the philological journals and so on. And then there's this great sense of crisis of really, well, what is this all about? Just producing material for the ref and rankings and ratings and all the rest of it. And so he's able to opt out of it in some way, well, in a very concrete way, because his pension arrangements allow him to go and retire after 10 years and he can wander around Europe. Very nice if you can do it. And I wonder if there is something about Steiner which does illustrate this dilemma, which is, the need for a discipline of thought, and that's what you find within the academy, but also the problem of that discipline of thought turning into something which is really essentially stultifying and deadening and killing what it's examining, and that forces people out of the academy, where if then anything goes. And the whole question is, how does one find discursive institutions which allow for rigorous debate and discussion, but don't in the end kill off what they're doing? And I wonder, in some ways, if a figure like Jung, not everybody's favorite, I know, and certainly not within the academy, but if Jung is the best example of someone who can solve that dilemma through the founding of institutions, the psychological club. I know the Jung Institute wasn't something that he necessarily wanted founded, but there was this sense that there was going to be collective discussion. And yet, so in the case of Jung, we have, if you want all your deeply spiritual stuff, boy, has he got it there in the Red Book, but he keeps the Red Book out of sight. Okay, so he does all that stuff, but that's then, well, for strategic reasons or for very good reasons, in terms of wanting to set up a new movement, a new organization called analytical psychology. You don't want to bang on about that stuff too much. Instead, you want to produce some papers and get going on your collected works and so on. But it actually seems to me to provide a more satisfying synthesis than someone like that Steiner does, in terms of the way that so often I find secondary literature on Steiner simply repeats what Steiner says and doesn't engage with it. I'm really not getting anywhere with this. It's just repeating what it said, and it's presented to me not as an argument, but as something which is to be assented to or to believe. And that seems to me problematic. Having said that, perhaps the way out is this: what was it that really helped revolutionize Nietzsche scholarship and our more general understanding of Nietzsche? It was the philological edition that was done by Colli and Montinari, the two Italian professors who get the Gesammelte Werke going, get the kritische Gesamtausgabe going of Nietzsche, and who give us the authentic Nietzsche texts, probably transcribed in their proper order, and all the editorial work done, all the explanatory work that's done. And this enables you to have as secure a possible a discussion, it seems to me, of what Nietzsche is about on the basis of the text, because you've got them in the most authentic as possible form. And as you touched upon, Aaron, that's not there with Steiner, is it? We don't have that clarity, and that seems to me, until that is philologically sorted out, that's always going to bedevil in some way, not simply his reception in academia, but more importantly, serious engagement with his thought, because we have this huge difficulty of knowing what was said, where, and when.
Yes, absolutely. I guess I could bring in one thing to also be fair about this. That I definitely agree with what you said there, and it has actually started a little bit. So they have, but this has also come with a whole host of issues, which and debates and so on. But they have begun this process of trying to produce some kind of kritische Ausgabe of Steiner's work. I think they have like 5 volumes now, and it's from Brigham Young University in I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's in the United States, and yeah, so they've produced a few things, and it's excellent. I use them in my dissertation, and absolutely, that's the kind of thing that's needed. I think, unfortunately, a lot of it, there's a certain segment of it which is lost, though, for a variety of reasons. I mean, a lot of it was also destroyed, and like here's an example. Like when I go to the Goethe Schiller archive, I have to sign things. I have to, it's very proper. Everything is beautiful. I wear some gloves. Okay. But if I go to the Steiner archive, it's not like this. I mean, the things are just around. Like it's gotten better and better, but it doesn't have like state sponsorship to keep everything in order. So, and also historically, not everything was collected. He didn't really write books. I guess it's still true of Nietzsche that he was just writing these things, little papers or whatever. But so I agree that I think it started, and I'm very happy about it, that there's now a journal called Science Studies, Steiner Studies. There's, I think, 5 volumes of these early work of Steiner. And that, I think it is going to take some more time. This is also why I wanted to do it the way I did, is to sort of like give other perspectives, other details of Steiner's life and so forth, particularly of him, into this academic environment. I'm doing it in religious studies, I realize, which is also a little bit different than taking a philosophical approach to Steiner. But I agree that that's the next step. And I think it has started. But of course, anthroposophy still exists quite strongly as a movement. So there's been interesting back and forth between them and these critical editions and so forth. I think mostly it's ironed itself out, but of course it also is, it's another area of tension, especially coming from religious studies. It's like religious studies, we are supposed to, at least now, like the way I was trained, you have to you don't want to influence the religion if you can, whatever that you're studying, whatever it is you're studying for that matter. So there's some tension there too.
Well, I guess one question to sort of wrap up in a way would be where to begin. I mean, of course, if you want to look at the overlap between Steiner and Nietzsche in text, I guess the clearest example would be Steiner's text on Nietzsche. So I think it's Fighter for Freedom, I think is the title. So that's the clear Steiner view. But I mean, Paul, is there much to go to from the Nietzschean perspective of Steiner's thought on Nietzsche, or even a Nietzschean perspective on Steiner?
No, I think that you've pointed people in exactly the right direction. There is the little paperback. If you want to get it in its original German form, like all these things, much better in the original German, of course, I would say that. But it collects all of the writings from 1895. Nietzsche, the fighter against his time, but it also contains the philosophy of Nietzsche as a psychopathological problem, essay of 1900, and of course that's interesting because that reminds me a little bit of what Klages does when he writes about the psychological achievements of Nietzsche. So that's a maybe slightly different take, and one which I think is actually quite refreshing in some ways. Then I think if people go to Steiner or Nietzsche themselves, they're probably going to find it that's the source to go to. Or look at his writings on Goethe and Goethean Science. But really, it's then when one looks at things like, can you gain knowledge of higher worlds? That's where I think most people are going to find that they have difficulties. But maybe that's just me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is there anything either would like to add in that you feel is key for the relationship between Steiner and Nietzsche that we've missed?
Yeah, I have one final question that we didn't get to, just to see what is said. Because one of the things that you and I had mentioned, James, was this idea of about Nietzsche and Christianity, And of course, we then did a talk on Steiner and Christianity, his vision of Christianity, his version of it, his Christology. And so I was, in preparation for this, I was trying to look a little bit in Steiner for some kind of points of agreement or something between his Christianity and what Nietzsche had, because I think that there is more to something like the Antichrist than just reading the title and having a reaction, or something like that. But for the most part, what I found in Steiner is that he does feel that at those books at the end of his life, he goes in this, like, literally goes in this anti-Christian direction. I mean, frankly, he says that he sort of became possessed by anti-Christian forces that were writing through him, So at that point, they're definitely splitting ways, because Steiner is doing much more Christian occultist stuff, towards the end of his life and just developing it. So I guess my question was, do you think that that's accurate, especially maybe for Paul too, because I know you just did a new version of the Antichrist. I mean, is the Antichrist the title, and that's how we should see it in respect to Christianity? A little bit like maybe Steiner did, or is there something deeper there? Not pro-Christianity, if you know what I mean, but trying to maybe even again like Steiner, trying to open the way for new Christianity, new ideas about Christianity, something like that.
Well, no, thank you for that. I think that one would be hard pressed to say that Nietzsche is hoping to found a new form of Christianity, but I think it's significant and a great contrast with Steiner and after what you've just been saying there, which is that Nietzsche has nothing critical to say about Christ himself, and it all turns on St. Paul. Who twists the gospel, who turns it into this gospel of hatred, and entirely misses the point of what Christ himself is about. And then the church builds on Paul, and it all goes downhill from there. So it's a very nuanced critique of Christianity. I mean, there's some pretty heavy duty rhetoric that Nietzsche fires off in the course of the book, and I think that makes it difficult for its reception to today. But round the figure of Christ, Nietzsche is almost awesomely respectful, one might say. That doesn't seem to be the case with Steiner. Once he gets his hand on the material and wants to start, producing new gospels and new mystery dramas and so on. And I guess that would be one of the differences that I would say that comes out most strongly for me between these two thinkers, whose overlapping parts I think we have nevertheless been able to explore, I hope. And that is, Steiner comes up with his own form of acting, dancing, own form of drama, rhythmics, and so on, and puts on these large plays. Tries to stage Goethe's Faust, of course, interestingly, in its entirety. One of the few places where it's ever been done. But Nietzsche doesn't do that. Nietzsche writes Zarathustra, but we're not then expected to sort of dress up as a lion or act out these things in some way. It remains fundamentally conceptual. And at the end of the day, in Ecce Homo, he says, one of these days, he says, what I hope they'll do is to found for the study of my Zarathustra an academic chair. There's still something, he hasn't quite escaped academia in some ways. There's still some sort of lingering desire to remain within academic circles in some way, whereas Steiner has completely escaped from them, but maybe to the detriment in terms of the way that he articulates his own thought. I don't know.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Just maybe the final comment on that is, so we've shown they definitely have overlap, but we've shown the overlap and the differences, which I think was the point, right? I mean, nor would Cabe say we're going to conflate these two, but I think they have interesting resonances and differences that are worth noting, right? Something like that.
I mean, there was one quotation that I'm fond of from Nietzsche in The Will to Power, right near the end. He says that the leveling of European man needs to be accelerated. We can't just sit here. So I think the similarities between the two is that both of them at that point in time noticing some cultural, either a stagnation along with the new technology, which is turning everyone machinic, moving towards the quantified, along with the death of God, which has been brought about by the Enlightenment. There is this like, okay, if we stop here, this is not a good place to stop. So Nietzsche is sort of saying the nihilism and saying, well, if you're going to have nihilism, we just need to push it. Like, where's that? We need to level European man. Whereas I guess with Steiner, he's saying, well, let's accelerate it in the other direction and try reveal everything from the above and try break. They're both breaking things, basically. None of them are saying, I think, but it's interesting, Paul, you said to me about how, in our chat in the Antichrist, Nietzsche, because he's got that finitude or finiteness of his life always in front of him, he's almost working in a panic throughout all these styles to be like, I just need to get this out. And I also get that impression with Steiner of both of them, I think, have imbued the culture within them, the idea that if we stop, this could be really to our detriment. We really need to push through right now. And you see that in both of them, that they just work almost like in a mania.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what you put your finger on there, James, is this idea of thought as actually being something which they are absolutely passionate about, and this driving passion is so important for them, and that's what they didn't find in various ways in the academy, and maybe it's still a valid critique, which is that for all the emphasis there's on assessment and rating, that if you don't have that passion, then in fact you're not really doing your job properly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems like a good place to finish up. So thanks to you both.
Thank you, James, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you.